Hey, he's not quite ready yet. Okay, so Hebrews chapter 11. So if you see on the screen, that's what's been on the news every day for the last week or so. These are the fires in LA. This is the Great Fire of Los Angeles. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to put this in perspective. Other great cities in the world have had great fires. Think of any? Chicago fire? Rome had a fire? San Francisco had a fire? London had a fire. So how do those stack up to this one? Los Angeles 2025. The cause is suspected arson. We don't know exactly how it started yet. 12,000 homes are lost so far, according to a search that I saw. San Francisco, 1906, started with an earthquake. There were 325,000 people displaced. 250,000 of them were homeless. 75,000 of them left town. On the San Francisco Fire Department website, it calls it the fire that destroyed a great part of San Francisco in 3 days, beginning April 18th, 1906, was the greatest conflagration humans have ever witnessed. Chicago, 1891. Mrs. O'Leary's cow? That's the story. So it started in Mrs. O'Leary's barn, and it started with a lantern kicked over that caught some hay on fire, and the suspicion was it was Mrs. O'Leary's cow. The comment was, or there is also suspicion there may have been people gambling in the barn, and in the course of gambling, inadvertently knocked over the light. So, not sure who actually caused it. 100,000 people homeless after the Chicago fire. London, 1666, started in a baker's oven. It left 100,000 people homeless, and it took decades to rebuild the city. Okay, so let's go to Rome. Compare that to Rome, 64 AD. We don't know exactly what the population of Rome is, but it was somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people. And the stories that came out are that half the people of Rome were displaced, 50% left homeless. So that's somewhere between 250 and 500,000 people. So it's as many as San Francisco and maybe as many as the 4 US fires combined. Okay? 64 AD. So his enemies blamed Nero for starting the fire. Nero blamed the Christians. So imagine that you are one of the Christians. Actually, no. Imagine that you are a person who knows the Christians in Rome, and you're tasked with writing them a letter to encourage them. What would you say? That's what the book of Hebrews is. The book of Hebrews was written to, we think, to Christians, to Hebrew Christians in Rome, and they've been blamed for the fire. I've seen some pictures on Facebook of pictures, a thing will show up and say, this is the guy that started the fire in LA. 12,000 people lost their homes and everybody focuses on the guy. How would you like to be the guy that has that picture on you in Rome? Has that. So what has he done in this whole book? So how has he gone about and encouraged the Christians there? So I have your handout here. This is a reminder of where we are. So I'm sure the author didn't have this in his mind when he's writing it, but it captures the idea. So if you go to the center, all those blue things, in each one of the 4 sections, this will be like a clock, so you're starting at the upper right, and we're going around clockwise. So he tells some great thing about Christ. Christ, he gives a passage that explains exactly how great Christ is. And so that first section, he's greater than prophets, angels, Moses. What should you therefore do? You should fear that you're falling short of the rest God promised. You should be diligent. You should hold fast your faith. You should draw near to him. If you do that, you'll find rest. If you don't, you'll find failure. So now go down to the second section. He comes back and he talks about Christ as a priest. He's greater than the priesthood, than the Levitical priesthood. So what should you do? You should press forward in maturity. And if you do that, you'll find blessing, looking clockwise. If not, it's worthlessness. Next section, he talks about Christ again as the builder of the house. He's greater than the law. He's greater than the tabernacle. He's greater than the covenant. What should you do? You should draw near to him in faith, hold fast in hope, and consider the things to do, which is on love. So faith, hope, and love. So if you do that, you'll have enduring confidence. If you don't, you'll have a fear of judgment. Okay, so now he's to the point where we're making this personal. So we're coming to Hebrews chapter 11. So Christ is greater than all those other things. Christ is also greater than all circumstances. So what is Hebrews 11 called? The faith chapter. Sometimes called the Hall of Fame of Faith. So it's a history of, and what we're going to show is all of the circumstances that believers have faced over time. And so as we go through, so all this yellow circle, they're keyed by the words, let us, remember? So all the way around. So he's going to, after he goes through the Hall of Fame of Faith, he's going to say, now, Christ is greater than all circumstances. Let us lay aside, run the race, show gratitude, go to him only, offer up sacrifices. So, and if we do, we'll realize the blessings. Okay, so that's where we're going. So, okay, Tato, if you come up, I'll give you a background. I'm going to... So the lead in to chapter 11 is here. If you go back to 10:32, he says, 10:32, remember the former days when you endured a great conflict of sufferings. 34b, you have yourselves a better possession and an abiding hope. Don't throw away your confidence. 35, instead, recognize the need for endurance. Faith is the secret to endurance. Now, let me tell you about faith. So that's the lead in. So, it's hard to believe this. I wrote this song 30 years ago. I think it's been sung like twice in 30 years. And so what it is just the text of the characters of Hebrews chapter 11. So we're going to go through and we're going to sing Hebrews chapter 11. Okay? And what's the tune? Love Lifted Me. So if there's anybody in the other room that would want to come in and help us, we'd be glad to have that. Okay.
I'm going to play the end of the chorus, and we're going to jump into the first verse. By faith Abel offered up a sacrifice approved. By faith Enoch walked with God until he was removed. By faith Noah built an ark and saved his family. By faith Sarah bore a child for all to see. How the child wondered to see. God offered you. How the child wondered to see. Amen.
I turned the mic off while I was singing because you didn't want to follow me, you wanted to follow him. Okay, so that diagram that I showed you, this is the fourth quadrant. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump forward to Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. So this is the great section on Christ in this portion. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to start and read the core sections that you have in blue there, and I'm going to lead up to this one. So let's pick out the great things that are said about Christ in this book. Starting in chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions and in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the world. And he is the radiance of his glory in the exact representation of his nature, and upholds all things by the word of his power. When he had made purification of sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much better than the angels, as he inherited a more excellent name than they. Now let's go over to chapter 5, verses 8 to 10. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered, and having been made perfect, He became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation, being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Now let's go to 7:26. For it was fitting that we have such a high priest, holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, exalted above the heavens, who doesn't need daily, like those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people, because this he did once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men as high priests who are weak, but the word of the oath, which came after the law, appoints a son made perfect forever. Now, the main point of what's been said is that we have such a high priest who has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister in the sanctuary and in the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched, not man. Now let's go to 12:1 and 2. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses, the witnesses are those in chapter 11, witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and every sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that's set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, and who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Okay, so those are the glorious things that are said about Christ. So now, in this passage, we're going to talk about Christ. Christ has been shown to be greater than all those other things. Now he's greater than all of the circumstances. So, I'll walk you through again this lead-in. So, what he said in chapter 10, he basically said, you guys started well, but you need to finish the race well. You started well, but you're not doing well right now. So, remember they're in the fire. So, let's pause again and talk about where Rome is in 64 AD. So, who's the ruler? Nero. Who are the leaders of the church? Peter and Paul. What's happened to Peter? Peter's already dead. Paul is imprisoned and about to die. What's happening in 64 is the fire, so this would be about 66, somewhere between 64 and 70, if this book is written somewhere in that span of time. So what's happening in Israel? The armies of Rome have marched and are gathered at Caesarea ready to take over the whole country. And in a few years, at 70 AD, they're going to wipe out a significant portion of Israel and the temple. Okay? So you're sitting there, a Jewish Christian in Rome. So you've left your Jewish background, you've accepted the Messiah, and what happens is all of the leaders that you look to are either imprisoned, dead, or about to die. Everybody around you. So, interesting thing, I don't know if you remember this from what I said before, when they had the fire in Rome, it just destroyed something like 3/4 of the areas of Rome, the housing areas. Some of the ones that were most spared were the ones where all the Christians lived. That's another reason they got blamed for all this. So what happens is everywhere you go, everybody looks at you and says, I knew it was you. Okay? So that's the people to whom he's writing. And he's saying, he's going to tell them in chapter 11 that faith is what's going to take them through this situation that they're in. And he's saying in the lead-in, you had a good start. Let's go back, and I'm going to start with 32 of chapter 10. Remember the former days when, after being enlightened, you endured a great conflict of sufferings, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. So when the Jews became Christians, they were mocked, and they weren't part of Roman society, considered them outcasts because they worshiped only one God. The Jews didn't consider them outcasts because they were spurning Judaism. And so you showed sympathy to the prisoners and accepted joyfully the seizure of your property, knowing you have for yourselves a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore, don't throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. So they started out well, and then the fire or the situation that they're in after the fire, is a significant trial. For you have need of endurance, 36, so that when you've done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet, in a very little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay. But my righteous one will live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we're not of those who shrink back to destruction, but of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul. And then he starts in, let me tell you about faith, verse 1. Okay, now I'm going to have to skip forward past the song here. Okay, so first of all, a question. History. What you're going to see in Hebrews chapter 11 is history, right? I mean, it's time sequenced. It starts with the Garden of Eden all the way up through all the martyrs of the Old Testament, okay? So it's going to walk you through mostly chronologically. So when the Bible tells history, is it simply a recording of people, places, times, and events? The key word is simply. The answer is no. Okay, so if I were to ask you, of the 19 kings that there were in Judah, how many were good kings and how many were bad kings? Do you know that number? Do we know that number? Yeah, because every king, it says, this was a good king because he did this. And it said, this one did evil. Okay? So it's not just a recording of the events. When the Bible tells a story, it's giving events, but it's also giving an interpretation of the events. So this is why it happened. So it's not just saying at the Tower of Babel, people started speaking in all sorts of different languages. It explains why that happened. So it's giving the how and the why. When they went into exile, did they know why they went into exile? Sure. They violated the covenant. So it goes all the way through. It starts in Deuteronomy when Moses says, I know that you're going to turn away from the Lord, and this is what happens. And he pre-writes history. You know, you're going to get kicked out of the land, and when you repent, God will bring you back into the land. Okay, so this is throughout the Old Testament's history. So, is this also true of non-biblical history? Sure, that's why history has become such a controversial topic in schools. So what happens is people don't like they don't like writing about what happened. They don't like writing about Columbus and what Columbus is doing, so we don't have Columbus Day in school anymore. You know, we don't have some of the other holidays because they want to rewrite the history. They don't want to give the history as it was because we don't like that history. So we don't like the explanation of the history. We don't like the reason for it. And so we're going to do our own. And I got a good example of that. So Some years ago, I signed up. I did an ancestry test. Where you spit into this little, I don't know, vial, and you send it off, and they tell you what your ancestry is and what countries you came from, and it's done by Ancestry.com, and then you can go pay what I think is an unfair amount of money to go research your own ancestry on their site. And they want to charge every month, and it's expensive. So what I do is I pay for it for a few months out of the year, and I go do a lot of research, and then I hold it there for a while. So like in the wintertime. So that's what I'm doing right now the last couple of months, is I'm going back and sort of filling in my background. And so I discovered that, lo and behold, in about 1500 and something, I'm related to John Fox. He's like my 14th great-grandfather. Of course, now I have like 4,014 great-grandfather. 14th great means, you start with your grandfather, and then the next one's your great, and then the next one's 2 great, 3 great, great. So he's the 14th. Great, whatever. So I have, what? So the point is, I have basically 0 of his DNA left. But he wrote Fox's Book of Martyrs. So what happened is, this is the time of the Reformation. This is just before Henry VIII. He's in England. So what happened is the Reformation had started, and the Catholics were persecuting all the infidels. And John Fox wrote a book documenting all of the persecutions of the Roman Catholic Church and basically justifying the Reformation, the people of the Reformation, as good and godly people who were then persecuted by the Catholic Church. And in later editions, he went beyond that time frame to previous generations all the way leading up. So anyway, his book was published in 1563 to justify the Reformations. In Puritan households, it became the most widely read book outside of the Bible. And the reason was, the Puritans didn't trust anybody else's history. So it's one thing to say there's history as to what happened. There's another thing to say why it happened, and he's the one we trust with why it happened. So, given that explanation, what would you expect to be the key to, what should we look for in Hebrews chapter 11? We shouldn't look just at the events and the people of Hebrews 11, but we should look for the interpretation as to what that means. So let me give you examples. So most of the song we sang this morning is all the by faith. Most of Hebrews 11, the verses start with, by faith, so-and-so did this. By faith, so-and-so did this. Okay, and sometimes it's by faith Moses, and it was passive on his part. I mean, his parents are the ones who had the faith. It wasn't Moses who had the faith, but by faith at the time of Moses, he was saved. So, but there are 4 sections in this passage that link it all together. So let's start with 1 and 2. So 1 and 2 say, what is faith? Chapter 11:1. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the men of old gained approval. So then he's going to start in talking about the men of old. So what is faith? The assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Other ways to describe faith. And then he's going to go through it in chapter 4. He's going to talk about Abel offering a better sacrifice. 5, it's going to be Enoch, who walked with God and then was taken. And then it's going to get to 6. So he only covers 2 people, and then he does another aside. So, why is faith important? Because without faith, it's impossible to please God. Right? How do you please God? One way. One way. Without faith, it's impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. So what is faith? Why is it important? Now let's go back and give some more examples. By faith, Noah, being warned about God, built an ark. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place where he was sent. And by faith, he lived in an alien land, lived as an alien. By faith, Sarah herself received ability to conceive. Therefore, there was born of one man, as many as the stars of heaven in number. Now, in 13, we come back to, when's faith going to be consummated? When's it going to be wrapped up? So here's what it is, 1 and 2. Here's why it's important. What's the end game? Okay? So what is the end game? 13 to 16. All these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them, and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they're seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. So God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So he's taking the example of Abraham and Sarah, where they leave and go to another land, and then he's extrapolating this to all these people. So when they're called, they're in a situation in life, and they have been given a mission. God says, I want you to leave her, I want you to go here. And Abraham obeys him. And so the example is true of all these other people. Going back, did Abel do what he was supposed to do? He offered the right sacrifice, right? Did each of these people did what they were doing? So he's extending that country analogy to all of them, and basically saying they looked beyond the circumstances where they are to the end, to heaven, or to what God has in store as part of his plan, to where he is taking history. Okay? So, when's it going to be consummated? The answer to that question is not yet. Okay, then goes 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac and considered that God would bring him back. Isaac, verse 20, blessed Jacob and Esau, even regarding things to come. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshiped. By faith, Joseph basically gave orders that he wanted to be taken back to the land. He had confidence that God was going to fulfill that. By faith, Moses was hidden by his parents. So his parents are the ones with the faith, but Moses benefited. Then when he was an adult, 24, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh. By faith, he left Egypt, 27. So Moses gets a long section here. By faith, he kept the Passover. By faith, they, Israel, passed through the Red Sea, verse 29. Verse 30, by faith, the walls of Jericho fell down. So now we're into the conquest. By faith, Rahab the harlot didn't perish along with the others. Okay. And then he goes on and says, okay, we've numbered them one by one. Now let's move out to the sort of wider world. Were these the only ones? No, there's others. You don't need to know all their names. What you need to know is what they did. So, verse 32, what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. So I'm not going to name all their details. I'm going to name them, and you know their stories. who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. From weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrections. Others were tortured, not accepting their release in order that they might obtain a better resurrection. Others experienced mockings and scourgings, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were tempted. They were put to death by the sword. They went about as sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated. And then a summary: men of whom the world is not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. So what's part of the message here to the people in Rome? You're not alone. This has happened all through history. All through history, believers have suffered in this world. So this is from every generation, from Adam to you. Believers have gone through this. And they have endured, and in their generation, were we at the consummation of faith? Nope, not yet. Every generation. It reminds me that I loved the commercial when I was growing up. The little kid outside, the mother said they're making soup for lunch. And he would come to the window and say, "Is it soup yet?" You know, she was mixing up the condensed soup and, heating it up. And finally, the last time she said, "It's soup." Well, this is faith. Is it done yet? Nope. It's coming. Okay. So then the last one. So here's what he's done in the chapter. He said, what is faith? Why it is important? And each of these is illustrated. Why is it important? When's it going to be consummated? And how are we connected to those heroes? So I think this is important, 39 to 40. So this is the, what does it all mean to me? All of these, having gained approval through their faith. So God said, "I approve." Did not receive what was promised. So God was pleased, but they didn't necessarily have the outcome that they were looking for. Because God has provided something better for us, that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. So each person has their own assignment that they were given. There's assignments that people have been given in this church that I wouldn't want. There's medical conditions that I wouldn't want. There are, other kinds of family situations that I wouldn't want. There's work situations that I wouldn't want. And I haven't been given those. And I may be given one that you won't want. So everybody had their assignment. And what happened is those who accomplished their assignment were building for the next generation, and they were building for you. So all of this was leading up to the coming of Christ, okay? And now you're on the other side of that, okay? So you are, you can now look to Christ, which they didn't have that benefit. So they were all leading up to that process. This was all part of God's tapestry. He's building this and he's leading up to the point of time where you are. So each of them had their part, and they weren't complete until the next person that they handed the baton to took it, and the next person that they handed the baton to took it. Now the baton's been handed to you. Right? So what are you supposed to do? Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses, 12:1. Who are the witnesses? They're the ones that had the baton before. They handed the next guy, who handed the next guy, who handed the next line. And so with great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance. So what's the idea of that? When you run, you don't want to be weighed down with all sorts of extraneous stuff. So let us lay aside encumbrance. And some of those encumbrances are the sins. So let's get rid of that. Let's get right with God. Let's get our relationship right, because until we do that, we're not going to get anywhere. And let us run with endurance the race that's set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus. Now let me ask the question. Had anybody in that list been told to fix your eyes on Jesus? No. So what happens is we are further along in the plan of God, and we now know what the key point of history is. The key point in history was Christ. And now we can fix our eyes on him. And all that he said in this whole book, now we realize who Christ is. What does it say in 1-4? He's the creator. He's the one who holds this world together. He's not a priest, he's greater than the priest. He's not an angel, he's greater than the angels. He's not the house, he's the builder of the house. Okay, so now that you know that, what you're going to do is you need to fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. Okay, so did he have an easy life? No. Who for the joy set before him, he looked beyond what he's going through. For the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of God. Okay, so that's how he's going about encouraging them. So what we're going to get to, I don't know, I'm not going to go back. You can look at your page in front of you. What we're going to get through, we have 2 more chapters, 12 and 13, and he's going to give 5 more, let us do this. Let us lay aside, let us run the race, let us show gratitude, go to him, offer up. Now, within the book, there's lots of other commands, and there's going to be more in this passage. This is a practical section. This is like when Paul writes. He said, okay, we're now, let us do all these things and remember to do this and this and this and this. There's going to be several details in this next couple of chapters before we get to the end. But he's going to say, but stepping back from this, okay, so what is the whole book of Hebrews written for? He's basically saying, you guys got troubles, right? Those troubles are part of God's plan for you. It's where he's placed you. It's your challenge within the Christian life, within God's greater plan of history. So he's given that your challenge, and your job is to focus on that and focus on the resource that you have. Put your faith in Christ. You may not live through it, but that's okay because there's something better on the other side. You may live through it and those of you do are going to pass the baton on to the next generation. Okay? So that's what it's about. Okay, I'm up to my time. So next week we're going to do 12, and then we're going to do 13, and then we're going to do a week of summary, and we're going to be done with Hebrews. Sound good? Okay, let's pray. Father, thank you for Hebrews. Thank you for the challenges that you've given to each one of us. We're not running a race with anybody else here. We're running a race that you've set before us, the race that is our race. And we know, Father, that you have planned it in eternity. And our job is to just look to you and to trust you and to walk humbly with our God in following it. And we just ask, Father, that you would give us clear direction as to how you would have us to go about doing that and to be trusting you to make it happen. And thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.